Order, order. Welcome to Westminster Hall. If members will bear with me, I have to read the pre-flight briefing. I remind honourable members that there have been some changes to normal practice in order to support the new call list system and to ensure that social distancing can be respected. Members should sanitise their microphones before they use them and respect the one-way system around the room. Members should speak only from the horseshoe. Members can only speak if they are on the call lists. This applies even if debates are undersubscribed. Members cannot join the debate if they are not on the call list. Order, order. Sir Iain Duncan Smith to move the motion.
Mr Hollobone, it's a great pleasure to see you in the chair. Having now wiped my microphone, I feel like I'm ready to go. So today's debate is clearly about the recent report on China's rapid expansion of mass labour programmes in Tibet. This was a paper published by a leading human rights advisor and scholar, Adrian Zenz, who co-published it with a group of which I am a member called IPAC, which is the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. There are others in this room who are themselves also part of that. That is both left and right parliamentarians in now 17 countries who are concerned about the behaviour of China across a range of issues. And this was co-published at the time. Adrian Zenz is a scholar in this area and has previously published a paper with IPAC also on the forced sterilisation of Uyghur women. I will touch on that, Mr Hollobone, shortly. So he is the one that has uncovered this through existing government papers. That is the interesting thing about this. None of this is secret. In a sense, it is quite open, and these government papers spell out exactly what has been going on. These are shocking findings, and funnily enough, with all the other debates about China, which I want to touch on in conclusion, but it is important to note that Tibet has gone, in a way, rather forgotten in all of these events. It's been an issue for a while, and then it's disappeared, and nobody seems to talk about it. What this paper has done has reminded us that even over a longer period than anything else, the Chinese authorities have been bearing down on the human rights in Tibet of those of the indigenous population in Tibet for some time. But the findings on this report are particularly interesting because they show that there has been mandatory, and I use this word advisedly, vocational training. That basically means sort of driving out the sense of identity of those people in Tibet. So these programs, and alongside those, forcible labour transfer schemes. These are sort of slightly gentle words. What they mean is that people are being taken from one place and put into camps, a bit like a lot like the Uyghurs that we uncovered, where they are forced to do labour, to hard labour, on all sorts of areas without proper pay or support. Over 500,000 labourers have now been collected together into these camps in the first 7 months of 2020. And local government officials are required by the government to meet quotas for what they term as recruitment to the scheme. It bears nothing like any concept of recruitment that we might understand. It basically means they have to get people in those categories into those camps as quickly as they can. This is overseen by strict military management, includes enforced indoctrination and intrusive surveillance of participants. And labourers also may be forcibly transferred to work all over China from their homes. In other words, this is not just camps in Tibet. This is people who are being moved around to fulfil requirements elsewhere. This has, of course, close similarities, which I want to touch on, to the training and labour transfer in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And the government attempts to dilute Tibetan identity are really critical here, and this is being done through this forced cultural assimilation. And this pattern is going on in a number of areas. And these government documents, interestingly, state that the programmes aim to reform Tibetan cultural, and I quote this, backwardness. Cultural backwardness. That is an interesting concept. It is a relative concept, and of course its relativity is defined by those in power, that is to say, the Communist Party of China. And this is achieved by enforcing learning of Mandarin and weakening, however they can, the religious influence that exists amongst those who would claim to be indigenously Tibetan. But, Mr Hollobone, this is not an isolated incident, because we have seen this kind of pattern of eradication of ethnicity, or attempted eradication, go on now across China. I mean, we know now from the parallel report that was published a little bit before this on the Uyghurs, that at least 1 million Uyghurs are in mass arbitrary detention in Xinjiang. Almost 400 prison camps in the region, more still under development at the moment. It's disgraceful, but we understand that Western fashion brands are using supply chains where such forced labour is prevalent, and I'm sure this applies also in due course, if not already, to the Tibetans. And the government-sponsored forced sterilisation and birth suppression in the Uyghur populations, which we believe is true, would meet, I believe, the genocide criteria. But we have yet to get the UN to even look at this at the moment, and that is the key. And civil servants placed in these Uyghur homes to monitor their behaviour, and children whose parents are detained are being taken from their families and placed in state facilities. But, Mr Hollobone, it goes on. It's not just the Tibetans, it's not just the Uyghurs, it is now also the Christians. Party members who profess a faith are now subject to disciplinary procedures. Arrest and detention of Christian leaders, such as Pastor Wang Yi of the Early Rain Church, detained in December 2018 and sentenced to 9 years in prison for, in quotes, inciting to subvert state power. I will indeed.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way, because these acts of repression never happen all at once. It's never a single thing that happens immediately. And does he share my concern at the reports that we're now hearing from southern Mongolia of the start of the same process of cultural and linguistic oppression of the local population there, which, if left if we don't call it out, you will probably see the same thing then start to happen there?
Yes, it's a pleasure to give way to the right honourable gentleman. He's been very early in on this and has been calling this out for some time, and I congratulate him for that. And I agree with him. We have to look at the starting point. People took their eyes off Tibet, but now look what's happening. The Uyghurs, people didn't want to talk about this, but look how far that has advanced. It is happening everywhere. And my point about the Christians is this has been going on for a long time. And there are threats, for example, in the Christian groups to withhold state support from any low-income Christian families if they do not give up their religious belief, and similar experience for Catholic churches as well. So it's not just churches that the government doesn't consider to be registered. These are also churches that they might even consider registered. And then you've got the Falun Gong. They've had almost the most appalling behaviour to them. 610 Office, which is a security agency tasked with solely persecuting the Falun Gong. Detainees do not renounce Falun Gong beliefs are subject to re-education through labour. Reports of beatings, solitary confinement, 24-hour monitoring, rack torture, tiger bench torture, water torture, stress position torture, forced feeding for those who are on hunger strike, forced injections of unknown drugs, and, of course, most shockingly of all, now confirmed stories of organ harvesting from those who have been incarcerated and treated like this. And Liu Gufu, a Falun Gong practitioner from Beijing, as I give this an example, was twice sent to RTL camps, these are the retraining camps, in Beijing. He reports being deprived of sleep, not allowed to use a bathroom or drink water. She was forced to consume feces and toilet water and was given unidentifiable drugs which made her lose consciousness. Mr Hollobone, I call on the government to call this out. And I also urge the government to do a series of things which I think would put the UK as a lead advocate in all of this. Number one, I think we now need to look at mandatory sanctions with regards to global human rights abuses. Sanctions such as travel bans or asset freezes. Officials who are responsible should have those Magnitsky arrangements set on them, and for the use of forced or compulsory labour in Tibet, and for that matter, in other areas too. The government should open a way for similar judgments to be issued on the cases regarding abuses against Xinjiang's, Uyghurs, and other minorities in China that I was touching on. The Lord's amendment to the Trade Bill, new clause 68, to nullify trade arrangements, past and future, if the High Court makes a preliminary determination that proposed trade partner has perpetrated genocide. I would urge the government to support that amendment in the Lords, because I can tell them now, should this come to the Commons, I will absolutely support such an amendment. And I urge the government also to meet GDP targets. China's economy needs to grow by some 7.5% a year, and they are therefore, under the cover of that, being given the capacity by Western companies and by Western governments who are turning a blind eye to behave like this. It's also worth reminding ourselves, beyond even the human rights abuses, China is now in breach of WTO rules endlessly across the piece. They incentivize companies through illegal discounts, tax breaks and subsidies. Even Volkswagen reported they had to buy a quota of components from local Chinese suppliers or pay more than double the standard import tax on these parts, which violates WTO rules, which everybody else is meant to obey. And China favours exporting finished products, which means basically they force companies to manufacture and produce. So these supply chain risk profiles are all in there, and they're there for us as well. And these supply chains in Tibet, Xinjiang and other regions are therefore linked to forced labour, and the government has to make it clear to British business that it is unacceptable to be in the slightest bit involved in any way with these chains. And I also ask the government to demand reciprocal access to Tibet and other regions, such as Xinjiang, in order to allow for independent international investigation into these reports of forced labour, and to call for a UN Special Rapporteur on Tibet. Mr Hollobone, in conclusion, the peculiarity of this is that if this was any other country in the world, every government would be calling it out. They would be demanding change. Imagine if this was a country in Europe or Africa or whatever, it would be immediate. There would be demands, there would be debates in the UN. This doesn't happen. Far too much of what we think and do about China is influenced massively now by this concern about getting goods, manufacturers, investments, etc. organised. And yet this country at the moment is involved in occupying the South China Seas, with the UN has said they have no right to that at all, and yet they are demanding and controlling whole areas of that. They've had border disputes recently with India, in which Indian soldiers have been killed, aggressive behaviour. And then we come to Hong Kong. I mean, how much more can we say about Hong Kong? Their abuse of what's going on, their dismissal of an international agreement with regards to the legalities, and also the incarceration now of many of those peaceful protesters and their shipment to China for prosecution, where they will certainly not get a fair trial. And by the way, I ask the government, what do they think of British judges now being employed still on the bench in Hong Kong? Surely it's time that we said enough. They can no longer give a kind of cover to what is going on in Hong Kong. This has to stop, for goodness sake. So I just simply, in conclusion, say there is one other action that the government can take. The Winter Olympics are planned to be in China. And many of us now believe that had this, as I said, been any other country, there would now be calls for these Olympics to be moved. I simply say to the government, they will have to take a stance on this pretty soon. Overall, Mr Hollobone, we are dealing now with a country that has, it appears now, bullied and threatened its way through all of this. It is imposing the most dreadful and terrible things on many of its own people. It is abusing human rights, and many now believe that it may even be guilty of a form of genocide. I simply say to my government, it is time now for them to stand up. It is time for this government to lead, and it is time for this government to act.
The question is that this House has considered reports of China's rapid expansion of the labour programme in Tibet, co-published by the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. The debate can last until 11 o'clock. I'm obliged to call the front bench spokespeople no later than 10:27, and the guideline limits are 10 minutes for the SNP, 10 minutes for Her Majesty's Opposition, and 10 minutes for the Minister. and then Sir Iain Duncan Smith will have 3 minutes at the end to wind up the debate. There are 5 very distinguished backbenchers seeking to contribute, and we've got 42 minutes of backbench time before the front benches come in. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Chair. I thank the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for bringing this debate to Westminster Hall today. And I echo what has already been said about human rights abuses in Tibet and in the People's Republic of China in general. It is shocking that in the 21st century we are still having to speak out against the barbaric acts of a totalitarian regime. The basic rights enshrined in such documents as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are the foundation stone on which human life can be lived in dignity. We have a duty to stand up for these rights not only on behalf of the persecuted people inside China, but also on behalf of all people, not least because the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to expand its influence around the world. I would like to speak more specifically about Adrian Zenz's recent report on militarized vocational training in Tibet, and to place it in the context of the CCP's long-term strategy in Tibet. Firstly, it is important to note that the report refers mainly to what is happening in the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region. This is only one part of Tibet. The vast areas of eastern Tibet are contained within the provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, Gansu, and Yunnan. We must be careful not to overlook the Tibetan people in these regions. There are about 6 million Tibetans living under Chinese rules. Although exact numbers are hard to ascertain, it has been estimated that until recently there have been roughly 2 million Tibetans whose lifestyle can be described as nomadic or pastoralists. They graze their herds on the high pastures of their ancestors have done for generations. Their way of life is fine-tuned to the harsh climate. The CCP has long sought to undermine this traditional lifestyle. The fundamental reason for this is that the pastoralist way of life perpetuates the distinctive Tibetan identity and culture. Together with the Tibetan language and Tibetan Buddhism, it is one of the pillars on which that distinctive identity and culture rests. The CCP has for decades seen the Tibetan distinctive identity and free spirit as a threat to their authoritarian rule. Just as the CCP wishes to cripple the Tibetan language through Mandarin education, as we have already heard, and just as the CCP wishes to cripple Tibetan Buddhism through the demolition of monasteries like Larung Gar, so it is trying to undermine the pastoralist lifestyle. This is the context for this report. The CCP's pretext for this action is framed in terms of economic development. The pastoralist lifestyle is characterized as backwards, and pastoralists are treated as surplus laborers who are lazy. Using a combination of superficial incentives and punitive force, the CCP has long been driving pastoralists off their ancestral lands into towns where they're expected to engage in the Chinese economy. The forced vocational training courses described in this report are nominally to give them skills that they can use in the towns. It must be affirmed, however, that this is a pretext. Considerable evidence amassed by Tibetans suggests that the lifestyle of pastoralists who are driven into towns is deeply degrading. Once in these towns, the Tibetan people are much more easily controlled within the horrifying systems of surveillance, like the grid management and double-linked households system described in the report. So to reaffirm the key point, the CCP's framing of their policies in Tibet in terms of economic developments are spurious. The issue here is of deliberate cultural destruction. In that sense, there are many similarities between the CCP's strategy in Tibet and the horrific cultural genocide that is taking place in Xinjiang. However, I would like to stress how important it is to take the situations in Tibet and in Xinjiang on their own, separate terms. We must be careful not to blur the important difference between the two cases, as that would only help to let the CCP off the hook on their specific abuses. On Tibet specifically, therefore, I call upon the government to bring Magnitsky sanctions against those members of the CCP involved in perpetuating human rights abuses in Tibet, as we have already heard. I also call about the government to adopt the private members' bills from the Honourable Member of East Worthing and Shoreham on reciprocal access to Tibet, which would make it harder for the CCP to continue to hide their abuses in Tibet from journalists, diplomats and independent travellers. And finally, and I think this is important and hasn't been mentioned yet, I call upon the government to publish its formal strategy of what to do whenever the current Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, dies. It is very likely that the CCP will try to use that moment to further undermine the Tibetan identity by appointing their own stooge Dalai Lama. We should be ready to stand in defense of the Tibetan people if and when that moment comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hollobone. Can I thank my right honourable friend for Chingford for bringing this debate today. He started off by saying that Tibetan is something of a forgotten issue. Over 20 years now, as a member of the All-Party Group for Tibetan, as co-chair for the last 5 years, I've been in this chamber, a very lonely chamber, raising the cause of Tibetan. So it's good to see many more honourable members from across the House here in support. Over these years, and last year, we marked 60 years since the invasion of Tibet, since when more than 1 million Tibetans have lost their lives at the hands of the Chinese. A regime that has brought about the suppression of basic human rights, such as religion, cultural identity, free movement and assembly, subject to arbitrary arrests, detention, disappearances, torture and racial discrimination, and one which is also imposing an environmental catastrophe on the world with the degradation of the Tibetan plateau, which is responsible for the water sources that feed or refresh almost 40% of the world's populations. That mustn't be a forgotten or hidden disaster anymore. China is now widely recognised as a serial abuser of human rights and cultural identity. It's been doing it in Tibet for years, but now, because of what's going on in Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs, with the suppression of the Mongolian minorities we're seeing more recently, and of course in Hong Kong, this human rights abuse is at last getting the attention that it so rightly deserves. Now, I'm proud to be a member of IPAC, as my right honourable friend alluded to, and I very much welcome this report. A few days ago, we marked the International Global Action Day on China, and I issued a statement on behalf of the All-Party Group on Tibet, which I want to put on the record. I said that on the day that the Chinese Communist Party celebrates the National Day of the People's Republic of China with a characteristic display of military might and global arrogance, we join the great majority of the free world in remembering the victims of Chinese oppression, past and present. For over 60 years now, the peace-loving people of Tibet have seen their liberty, their culture and their heritage systematically suppressed, and over 1 million have lost their lives upholding everyday freedoms that we take for granted in the free world. They continue to be persecuted within Tibet and increasingly amongst the widespread communities forced to live outside of their homeland. In the last few years, the suppression of minorities within Chinese borders has taken an even more sinister turn as we see the latest assault on the liberties of the Uyghur people, forced into concentration camps and subject to appalling sterilisation programmes that constitute genocide under UN definitions. In Hong Kong, which has for long been a beacon of freedom and creativity, China has thought nothing of reneging on international agreements to bring that population to heel, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with the brave citizens who continue to take a stand against the world's most oppressive superpower. And I hope that all honourable members would concur with that. In this report, the most extraordinary revelations have come about. The labour transfer policy mandates that pastoralists and farmers are to be subjected to centralised military-style vocational training, which aims to reform backward thinking and includes training in work, discipline, law and the Chinese language. I gather, Mr Hollobone, that the Chinese authorities ordered Tibetan nomads to wipe out Tibetan goats. The Chinese authorities deemed that the goats were detrimental to the environment, which is rather ironic given the environmental carnage that the Chinese Communist Party is waging in that region. So last year, all the goats in western Tibet, especially in the Dingri region, were wiped out. Tibetan nomads and farmers are now being turned into menial labourers and are concerned by the sudden change of their traditional nomadic or farming lives. This is the equivalent of the Westminster government telling Welsh farmers to kill all their Welsh lambs and retrain as shop assistants in IKEA, for example. Extraordinary. Why can't we call this out for what it is in China? Absolutely appalling. Over the last 2 years, more than 10,000 monks and nuns have forcibly been evicted from hundreds of destroyed monasteries and placed into internment camps for political re-education as part of the Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. Retired Tibetans are not allowed to go on pilgrimages to holy shrines. Tibetan children are not allowed to participate in religious activities during vacations. Possession of a photograph of the Dalai Lama is an imprisonable offence. The Honourable Lady for Bristol and the Honourable Gentleman for Dundee, who alas can't be here today, and I, last went to Dharam Sala and had the honour of meeting again His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. A more peace-loving group of people you could not find on this planet, and yet the torture and the horrendous suppression that they have been through is quite extraordinary, yet they retain their dignity in the face of such adversity. They've seen their holy sites Disneyfied for Chinese tourists. The new law passed by the Tibetan People's Congress in January of this year, called the Regulations on the Establishment of a Model Area for Ethnic Unity and Progress in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, and I use the autonomous bit loosely there, is all part of the Sinicization programme, despite a constitution which supposedly guarantees the autonomy and the cultural identity of those minorities within the Chinese border. The Tibetan language has been replaced by Mandarin in schools and banned from being taught in monasteries, and those from Tibet have reduced job prospects, certainly if they continue to use the Tibetan language. Tibetans have to register and seek permission to travel across the Tibetan Autonomous Region. In contrast, the Han Chinese do not have to have any permits to travel anywhere they like in China or the whole of the Tibetan Autonomous Region. There is mass surveillance of the population. We've had debates in Parliament about what Hawei is up to, and they are part of this surveillance, certainly in Xinjiang province, and in the monitoring of mobile phones used by Tibetans as well. The minoritizations of Tibetans. We've seen a mass inflow of Han Chinese and Chinese companies into Tibet, only employing Chinese-speaking migrants. And they reluctantly employ Tibetans where they have to, because in the higher parts, it's only the native Tibetans who can withstand the high altitude. There is no freedom of assembly. Those escape routes from those Tibetans who cannot tolerate this oppression anymore, which were through Nepal, have now been cut off because of the communist government in Nepal having done a deal with the Chinese. And there's a persecution of the Tibetan diaspora around the world as well, who live in fear of the long reach, the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party. And China is in denial about what's been going on in Xinjiang province until it was satellite photographs of these concentration camps that actually called them out in the end. So, Mr Hollobone, what should we do? Well, I'm very pleased with the Honourable Lady from Bath who mentioned my Tibet Reciprocal Access Bill, which I reintroduced again in this session, which is based on the piece of legislation passed in Congress unanimously, cross-party support backed by Marco Rubio from the Republicans and Jim McGovern from the Democrats, which has been put into effect, as a result of which Marco Rubio and Jim McGovern are not allowed to go to China, a badge of honour, frankly, because this calls for reciprocal sanctions against officials not allowing representatives of the British government or others to visit Tibet and to see the human rights abuses going on at first hand. We need this law, Mr Hollobone, in this country to send out a very strong signal that you cannot abuse your own people in secret. We will call it out, that human rights abuses of this magnitude, wherever they happen, must be called out, and China has no divine right to be able to be immune from being called out on this. We need a UN special investigation into genocide and the use of slave labour. We remember the Tesco Christmas card incident last year, where somebody found a message from slave labour being used to produce these Christmas cards in part of China. We must resist Huawei. We must resist the influence on UK boardrooms of highly paid British directors taking the Chinese shilling. I will briefly, yes.
I just wanted to say, does he not agree with me that right now there has to be a very public statement by the government saying to those who are taking money from China and then promptly defending them that this has to cease?
I completely agree, and perhaps we'll get it at the end of this debate. And we must also call out the Confucius Institutes, which are wielding sinister influence in our universities and increasingly in our school classrooms as well, where they're giving money supposedly to teach Mandarin, but there's another subtle agenda going on there as well. As my right honourable friend has said, the Magnitsky legislation is absolutely made for these sorts of abuses, and we must bring that forward. Last year, in conclusion, Mr Hollobone, I was at the Riga Conference of International Parliamentarians with the honourable gentleman from Dundee, where we issued the Riga Declaration. We all signed up to the Riga Declaration, which asked to give unimpeded access to Tibet to foreign journalists, scholars and researchers, diplomats and other foreign citizens, including those of Tibetan origin. It called on China to cease its policies and practices that harm the natural environment of the Tibetan plateau and to resume the dialogue with envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama without preconditions. And let me end with the Global Alliance for Tibet and Persecuted Minorities, who produced some of the information in this report. They call for this. The silence of the world community has emboldened the Chinese aggression and onslaught against Tibetans and Uyghurs who are being stripped of their human rights. Although much damage has already been done, it's high time that the international community should wake up and recognise the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party to peoples living under its rule and to those countries which are under the influence of China due to their monetary benefits and the huge debts which they offer. The crimes against the Uyghurs and Tibetans should be recognised as genocide according to the International Genocide Convention. Hear, hear to that, Mr Hollobone. It's time we vociferously called out the oppressive regime that is the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Mr Hollobone. Always a pleasure to see you in the chair. And I thank the right honourable member for bringing this report to the attention of this House. And I just wanted to specifically mention, because I know a constituent of mine will be particularly grateful that he mentioned the plight of the Falun Gong and the concerns about forced organ harvesting, as she's been waging a very long campaign to bring that to public attention. I also want to congratulate the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham for all the work that he's done as co-chair of the all-party group on Tibet and for the latest legislative move that he's put forward. As a vice-chair of the all-party group for Tibet, I did have the pleasure of travelling to Dharamsala with him and the Honourable Member for Dundee a couple of years ago now, and we met with the Tibetan Parliament in exile, and everything that he says about the peace-loving, sort of respectful nature of those people we met there is absolutely true. We've also welcomed Tibetan exiles to Parliament on a number of occasions, from the hugely impressive Lobsang Sangay, the Sikh-on, who's the political leader of the government in exile, to Buddhist monks. And again, you know, that it's... I would just echo what he says about the sort of humanity of the people and the desire they have for a peaceful solution to the situation in Tibet, but the grave injustice that they've suffered over the years. In Bristol, we have an active local group of people from the Tibetan diaspora, some of whom recently embarked on a walk from Bristol to London to raise awareness for their cause. And I was there to see them off at the start of that walk by the plinth where the statue of Edward Colston was recently pulled down by Black Lives Matter's campaigners, which obviously the statue marked another great injustice, and it was very fitting that they set off from that the site of that statue. And I know that those local campaigners are very grateful that this matter is being discussed in the House today. The report in itself is very worrying, but it is especially worrying when put in the context of China's wider human rights abuses. The coercive training regimes in Tibet aren't on the industrial scale that they are in Xinjiang, and there is not yet any evidence of extrajudicial internment, but this does bear worrying hallmarks of the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. The training of surplus labourers to remove backwards thinking and to teach Chinese language, work and ethics is the latest chapter in a long-running campaign to dilute Tibetan identity and assimilate Tibet to the Chinese provinces. 500,000 Tibetans have been recruited to the programme, which is very disturbing when you consider that the population only numbers 3 million. Of that 500,000 people put into the re-education camps, 10,000 of them are monks and nuns, I think has been mentioned. Conditions in these camps are so harsh that there were reports recently that one nun was driven to suicide. And outside the camps, the efforts to Sinicize Tibetan Buddhism continues. China has recently demolished 2 historic Buddhist academic institutions, Larangar and Yakangar. Tibetans are being detained for sharing photos of the Dalai Lama, sharing books written in Tibetan, and even speaking to relatives about the importance of the Tibetan language. This is a clear, orchestrated attempt to remove Tibetan culture from Tibet itself. What's happening in Tibet isn't only reminiscent of Xinjiang, but Hong Kong too, albeit for different reasons. The 17-point agreement lays out a framework for Tibet not dissimilar from Hong Kong's one country, two systems rule. But as in Hong Kong, that agreement has been eroded over time. I do also want to speak briefly about the brave Tibetans who have spoken up against China's environmental crimes in the region and have faced imprisonment and fines. I have to say I was particularly distressed to hear what the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham said about the goats being destroyed. And it's obviously wrong when you have human rights abuses on such a massive scale to be upset by what's happening to goats. But I think that is symptomatic of just the willful destruction of the Tibetan people's way of life in the plateau. The Tibetan plateau is not only a vital geopolitical region, but is home to the world's largest ice storage outside of the North and South Poles. A quarter of its ice has been lost since 1970. Even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, up to 2/3 of the region's remaining glaciers will disappear by the end of the century. And at the moment, we know that the Paris Climate Accords bind us to 2 degrees rather than 1.5, but we're not even on track for that. And currently, it's very possible that the Earth will be 4 degrees hotter by the end of the century. And when you think that the difference between the present day and the last ice age was only 6 degrees, I think that puts in context of just how massive an environmental catastrophe that should be. And it's not just about global warming. The Mekong, the Yangtze, the Ganges and the Indus rivers all have their sources in Tibet. 1.6 billion people are supported by the rivers, and the melting of the third pole will have a catastrophic effect on these people, and that will have global ramifications. Banks will burst, livelihoods will be destroyed, and there will be an unprecedented refugee crisis. But it will also affect geopolitical relations in the regions, and Indo-Chinese relations could turn ugly. So we do need to question Chinese the environmental record of the CCP in Tibet, just as we do its human rights records. And a couple of years ago, I was involved with Free Tibet in a campaign. Liverpool Football Club had entered into a sponsorship deal with Tibetan Water, which was a company that extracted and bottled water from Tibetan glaciers. And I think the football club just didn't have the slightest idea that there was anything wrong. They probably thought that this sounded like an incredibly, environmentally sound, pure type of project. But we just drew to their attention that actually they were facilitating, condoning, in some way complicit in what China was doing in terms of exploiting the natural resources of the region. And I'm glad to say that after a year, that sponsorship deal was dropped. So to conclude, Mr Hollobone, on the question of the trading relationship with China, obviously they're an incredibly important business partner of ours, but there does need to be a point where we put principles before our own economic interests. From 2011 to 2015, I was in the Shadow Foreign Office team for Labour, and as well as covering this part of the world, I also had the Shadow Human Rights Brief. And I remember that in September 2013, William Hague and Vince Cable launched with a great fanfare the Business and Human Rights Action Plan. We were the first country to present this sort of national action plan to implement the UN Guiding Principles, which has been developed by the former Special Representative to the UN General Secretary, John Ruggie. There were very warm words spoken about. I think that William Hague used the phrase that there were two beating hearts of a UK foreign policy, which was the business side and the human rights side. But it was only a couple of months later, in December 2013, that David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, led the largest ever trade delegation to China. And I tried to ask questions about to what extent this Business and Human Rights Action Plan factored in, in any way influenced that trade mission. And it became very, very clear. In fact, I think I remember a minister from the Lords coming along to a meeting that we had of the all-party group in China and saying it wasn't his job to think about human rights. He was there he was a trade minister. It was his job to do the trade side of things. And on a number of other countries as well, you know, Nick Clegg went to Colombia. I asked whether human rights were discussed there. And in fact, I ended up making an official complaint because his answers were so hopeless. David Cameron went to Saudi Arabia. And it's actually quite amusing to look at the answers that I got back when I asked if human rights were discussed. It was, we discussed a wide range of issues. So I asked again, nothing was off the table. And, you know, the endless sort of permutations of those sort of phrases. And it just became clear to me this Business and Human Rights Action Plan wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And I think it was very sad because I think the intention was there to really try to develop a more ethical foreign policy. So to conclude, we cannot allow countries like China to act in this manner with impunity. The government does need to seriously consider magnanimity sanctions on officials with ties to the situation in Tibet, as well as human rights abuses elsewhere in China. We should not pick and choose which human rights abuses we condemn and which by our silence we condone, but instead stand up unequivocally for human rights throughout the world.
Thank you, Mr Hollobone. I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this debate. I fully support his powerful speech and thank him for all the work he's done to raise human rights issues in China. I believe now that the government is actually listening. It's listening more than it did 3 or 4 years ago when the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which I chair, published this report, The Darkest Moment, the crackdown on human rights in China, 2013 to 16. It can be found on our website still, conservativehumanrights.com, and we made 22 recommendations within it, some of which have been echoed already here today. It is a tragedy that we are 4 years on, and yet we are still asking the same questions today. It included a whole section on Tibet. We reported on the limited civil and political rights of people in Tibet, and I quote, and the reason I'm doing this is partly because the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland, who I also pay tribute to for his work on this issue, talked about how there is a progression of abuse. We spoke then that the main causes of the Tibetan people's grievances are China's policies of political repression, cultural assimilation, economic marginalisation, social discrimination and environmental destruction in Tibet. We also detailed reports of testimonies about the treatment of political prisoners, including beatings by police and other security services during interrogation sessions, mock executions, electric shock treatment, the accused being locked in cells that were pitch black or so small they couldn't move, torture using iron chairs and other egregious breaches of human rights restricting freedom. What we didn't report on then, but which now we hear about today, is the forced abduction of hundreds, potentially thousands, of Tibetan people and effectively their imprisonment elsewhere. Can I ask the Minister to look at this report? We are actively updating it now, to look at the recommendations, but I also want, in the time I have left, to suggest or to support 4 ways in which the UK could effectively respond to these deeply concerning human rights issues in Tibet. Firstly, global human rights sanctions. I support calls for the government to consider using the Global Human Rights Sanctions Regulations 2020 to target officials responsible for the use of forced or compulsory labour in Tibet. Names have been given to us. This is a violation that's specified in these regulations. Those sanctioned under the regulations could face travel bans or asset freezes. We recall in announcing those measures that the Foreign Secretary commented that the sanctions would be the latest next step forward in the long struggle against impunity for the very worst human rights violations. So will the government now show it intends to fulfil that express purpose of these sanctions and hold the perpetrators of these human rights that we've heard of today, these abuses, to account? Sanctioning officials responsible for human rights abuses in Tibet would send out a clear signal that the UK will stand up for human rights globally, wherever they occur. It would, I hope, also open the way for similar judgments to be issued on cases regarding abuses against other minorities in China. And we've heard about them today, the Falun Gong, the Christians and others. And again, these were referred to in this report several years ago. I am deeply concerned today to hear of the similarities between the report we've heard of today and the situation we see in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. The international community and the UK must step up and play its global lead, must take action to stop Tibetans facing the same fate as the Uyghurs. Indeed, it may already be too late. So will we follow the leaders we've heard of the US in sanctioning officials? Secondly, with regard to modern-day slavery supply chains, and we've heard mention of this already, will the government work to ensure due diligence and risk assessments are completed by UK businesses and public bodies with supply chains in Tibet, in Xinjiang and other regions in China affected by forced labour? To do so would be in line with the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which requires, as we know, large organisations to report on efforts to ensure that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in its supply chains or any parts of its business. A study conducted by ASPI found that many household brands, such as Apple, BMW, Huawei, Nike, Samsung, Sony and Volkswagen, could be implicated in the use of forced Uyghur labour in the Xinjiang region. Similar concerns, as we've heard, surround the fashion industry, with potentially almost a fifth of the world's cotton supplies originating from Xinjiang. So I do urge the government to work with businesses to ensure that supply chains originating from Tibet are not similarly tainted with forced labour. To enforce this, the government should use their new powers to issue civil penalties for non-compliance with the Model Slavery Act, which require large organisations to report on steps they are taking to remove forced labour from supply chains and to demonstrate reasonable practices in their supply chains. Thirdly, reciprocal access to Tibet. We called for this in our 2016 report. We've heard of calls for it today. The government surely must now ask for reciprocal and unrestricted access so that we can ensure that there is an independent international investigation into reports of forced labour in Tibet and other human rights abuses. The Chinese government has systematically obstructed travel to the Tibet Autonomous Region and other Tibetan areas by foreign diplomats, officials and journalists. Reciprocal access would ensure that abuses in Tibet don't escape the world's attention. And can I also mention, I do want to, shortly before I close, pay tribute to the work of the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham. I support his bill. I think he made a most powerful speech. I thank him for the information that he brought to the Chamber today. And can I ask the Minister to look again at a further report, which I didn't bring today, that our Human Rights Commission has done on the Confucius Institutes, which the Honourable Member mentioned. It goes into some details about grave concerns about what is happening through their existence within our UK universities. And finally, can the Minister update us on the UN's position regarding the installation of a special rapporteur to investigate forced labour in China, and would he commit to raising this issue at the UN and call on the Secretary-General of the UN to install a special rapporteur to investigate forced labour in Tibet? This would provide an unbiased and thorough scrutiny of allegations of human rights abuses in Tibet. We need to ensure now that the government doesn't just listen, doesn't just speak, but acts.
Thank you very much, Mr Hollobone. And can I thank you for the opportunity to take part in this debate and congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Chingford in securing it. I should perhaps declare an interest that I'm also a member of IPAC, and I think that IPAC also are to be commended for the production of the report that he has tagged in the title for today's debate. If I can pick up a theme that was first touched on by the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham, it is heartening to see the level of attention that issues such as Tibet, the oppression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province, the situation in Hong Kong are now getting, but it has not always been thus. And I think we should acknowledge that there has been a significant attitude change in governments across the developed world towards China. And by and large, I welcome that. I think it's a positive change. But I sound one note of caution, and it is that in criticising the regime in Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, we do that because what they do is worthy of criticism. It's not about isolating or demonising China. China has the potential for being a force for good as a massive and growing economy. But, when we see that strength in the Chinese economy being used as a malign force in different parts of the world, and the way in which China has used its economic influence in Africa in particular, is something which is worthy of greater consideration, then we have not just the right but the duty to call it out. And it is the case, candidly, as the Honourable Lady from Bristol touched on, that governments of all stripes in recent years have been slow to the party in this. I remember the years when visits to this country under the Blair government saw protesters just shielded away from sight, so at the risk of offending the delegations. In 2013, Alex Salmond should have met the Dalai Lama when he came to Edinburgh. But on all these occasions, it's fair to say that the risk of upsetting China, getting on the wrong side of it, and somehow then being economically disadvantaged, was what I think meant that we made the wrong calls and we took the wrong turns. So I'm delighted that we see a different approach now from this government and others throughout the Western world. And it was for that reason, actually, that I made the point concerning southern, or as we often call it, Inner Mongolia. What we are seeing there has disturbing echoes of what you have seen in other semi-autonomous regions in China. And it starts with the linguistic oppression. It starts with the cultural oppression. But it never finishes there. And when we see it starting, that is the point at which we should be calling it out. So I know that today's debate is not about Southern Mongolia, and we can perhaps keep that for other occasions, but I would draw to the House and to the Minister's attention some of the recent work that is being done by bodies like this Human Rights Watch and the Southern Mongolia Human Rights Information Centre, and the reports that they published towards the end of August. The IPAC report that the Right Honourable Gentleman references reveals that Tibet now has a significant compulsory vocational training programme and forced labour transfer scheme, straight out of the Xinjiang playbook, I think you could say. Over 500,000 people have been enlisted by the programme in the first 7 months of 2020 alone. 49,900 of these were directly transferred to other parts of the province, and 3,109, according to the report, were transferred out of Tibet. It's easy just to talk about the figures, and horrific as they are, I think it's worth just pausing for a second to reflect what these figures actually mean. It means essentially that the people of Tibet are seen as tools of the state, and that they are deprived of the right and the opportunity to have any say in how and where they work. They have no freedom to choose how they live their own rights. It is a willful disregard of human rights and human dignity, and that's why we have the duty that we do to call it out. The report says that the forced labour programme is overseen by a strict military-style management. This limits the liberty of Tibetans in an attempt to remove their so-called backwardness. There is absolutely no place for an approach such as this in any working or social environment. And it is this obsession with conformity and uniformity that you see time and again in the way in which the government in Beijing approaches its people, and there is no place for that in a modern state. Tibet's treatment is part of the much wider programme that we have seen by the Chinese in other parts of its country. So, Mr Hollobone, the points that I really want to put to the Minister are, first of all, just to pick up on those made by the Honourable Lady from Congleton, the need to get observers and Human Rights Task Force badged under the United Nations into Tibet, into Xinjiang province, and other areas of concern. The need to undertake meaningfully the use of the Magnitsky-type sanctions, and to look at our own supply chains for companies selling and operating in this country, and to ask whether they have been using forced labour, and whether British businesses and public bodies should take this into consideration. The Modern Slavery Act we have from 2015 means that we have legal obligations as well as a moral imperative. This comes down to the most fundamental human rights that are imaginable. And the point that you should never forget about human rights is that they are universal. And if they don't matter in Tibet, if they don't matter in Xinjiang, then frankly, they don't actually matter here either.
Now come to the front bench speeches. Patrick Grady for the SNP.
Thank you, Mr Hollobone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to be back in Westminster Hall, and I want to join others in congratulating the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Wood Green on securing the debate and his incredibly comprehensive opening contribution, which has been followed by equally powerful contributions from members representing a wide range of parties and a wide range of views within some of those parties as well. But we're identifying, I think, as the member for Orkney was saying, a new and increasing consensus about the importance of speaking out about the actions of the Chinese state, and particularly in this debate, its treatment of the Tibetan peoples and other minorities. And the member for Worthing is right that my honourable friend for Dundee West, in other circumstances, would be here and has been a passionate campaigner with his colleagues on the all-party group on issues affecting Tibet over the years. And he he's been on the visits, and he's met some of the visitors, as I have had the privilege of meeting the Sikyong and others who have come to address the all-party group. But the report that is highlighted in the debate and the efforts of Dr Adrian Zenz have given a new level of coverage and awareness to the tragedies that are unfolding. And I think it's important also to recognise the role of journalists who have picked up on the report, particularly Reuters, who produced a very comprehensive piece of coverage and analysis in the face of the restrictions that journalists have that others have spoken about. And in attempting to seek some kind of response from the Chinese authorities. And I think the member for Worthing was right that for many people, the fact of Tibet, of Tibet and the oppression of Tibet and the exile of the Dalai Lama is a kind of static fact of life. But what this report has done is bring the reality home, the chilling reality of all the different horrors that we've heard over the course of the debate: enforced military-style training and education, the environmental degradation, what the report calls a coercive lifestyle change for the Tibetan people from nomadism and farming to wage labour, the strongest, most clear and targeted attack on traditional Tibetan livelihoods that we've seen since the Cultural Revolution, or, as others have said throughout this debate, essentially a form of cultural genocide, or indeed worse. And we know that the Chinese regime denies this. It says everything is voluntary, nothing is forced, but that does not match. It doesn't match the reality that has been reported and the experience elsewhere. We know, as we've heard, the United Nations estimates of at least 1 million people in Xinjiang, mostly from the ethnic Uyghur population, subjected to similar treatment, detained in camps, subjected to ideological education, forced sterilisation, as the member for Congleton said, and other horrors. And despite Chinese claims that these the participants in these camps have graduated, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute identified at least 14 detention facilities being built this year alone, 14 out of 380 that it has identified across the country using its satellite technology and other methods. So speaking up and speaking out has to be an important first step, and global leaders must recognise and respond to this report and other similar analysis. And I think, again, the member for Orkney and Shetland was right that there is a changing global attitude towards this, and we have heard throughout the contributions of members in this debate the options that are open to governments, and that must include the UK government. So whether that is travel bans for identified officials, the use of Magnitsky sanctions, the implementation and the monitoring of the Ruggie principles, and the action plans on business and human rights that the member for Bristol spoke of, questioning the role of specific companies. And we've had a lot of debate in the House recently about the role of Huawei, particularly how it is allowed to operate here in the United Kingdom. And most importantly, I think, that right of independent access for monitoring for journalists, for academics, for international observers to Tibet and the other regions. And so the United Kingdom government has to support all of these calls. This is an important moment for the UK. If it wants to emerge now as a new global Britain, it has to demonstrate that it will have the courage to rise to these challenges. And that's why the questions around participation in the Winter Olympics in 2022 have to be part of that consideration, have to be part of our use of soft power and how we make our views on these issues felt around the world and how we engage. If she wants to engage very quickly.
I mentioned it before, but will he agree that one of the most perilous moments is when the Dalai Lama dies, because it creates an interregnum, and that the Chinese Communist Party will use that moment to undermine the Buddhist tradition and Buddhist spiritual leadership? We've got to be aware of that. Will he agree?
She is absolutely right, and I know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself has said that perhaps he'll think about whether or not he wants to be reincarnated, and the Chinese government will have to take that into account as well. And if we're going to talk about religious minorities, a growing number of adherents to the Catholic faith are also concerned about the Vatican's relationship with China, and I think we must bear that in mind as well. And the member for Orkney and Shetland spoke about the Scottish Government's previous relationship with China in the context of how other governments' relationships have changed. The current First Minister, when she did visit China, made a point of speaking out on human rights, on equality, on women's rights, and made the point that economic growth and equality have to go hand in hand. You can't have successful, sustainable economic growth without respect for equality and human rights, and that has to be remembered. And in all of this, we have to think about our own individual responsibilities as well. The member for Bristol spoke about bottled water and supply chains, and we've heard that from other members as well. And I think we all have to think about, when our consumer goods appear to be too good to be true in terms of the price or the quality, whose hands have made that cheap clothing, our cheap electronics, as the member for Congleton said, our cheap hand sanitizer for that matter, our face masks that have suddenly become ubiquitous. These wipes have been made in Turkey. I made a point of checking that before I spoke. But many of the face masks we're wearing are made in China. It's very clear. I just want finally to pay tribute. The member for Congleton for Bristol East spoke of one of her constituents. I had a constituent who died very sadly during the summer, Yu Williamson. She moved to the UK from China as a young woman, and when she came here and was able to have access to a free media and understand the truth of the regime that she had been brought up in, from that point, she never stopped campaigning for the rights and freedoms of her people, particularly the rights to the Tibetans, for their self-determination, for religious freedom across the country, particular concerns about organ harvesting and the oppression of Falun Gong practitioners. She was an ardent lobbyist. It's possible members in this room will have met her if they were ever outside in Parliament Square, because she was a regular presence at the Falun Gong protests that would take place outside. And her campaigning meant that she was never able to safely return to the country of her birth. So I just want to particularly remember her in this debate and send my deepest sympathies and condolences to her family and her many friends in Scotland and around the world. And I would commend the beautiful obituary that appeared in the Herald. I'll maybe send it around the members that have taken part in this, because I think we owe it to people like you, to countless other campaigners around the world, to the millions who are suffering under oppression in China, to continue to challenge and question the actions of the Chinese regime, and I hope that the Minister will rise to that challenge today.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green, who gave such a powerful speech today, really calling out the list of issues that there are around the behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's Hong Kong, what's happening in the Himalayas, the South China Sea, and I think that really set the stage for what has been an excellent debate today. I wanted to pay tribute as well to my colleague, my honourable friend for Bristol East, who gave a powerful critique of the Human Rights Action Plan, and I think demonstrated in what she said that our values are not for sale, that when it comes to the constant debate there is between trade priorities and human rights priorities, really that debate should not be existing at all, because the priority is to stand up for our values, stand up for human rights. And as the Honourable Gentleman for Orkney and Shetland so rightly put it, if human rights don't matter in Tibet or Xinjiang or other parts of the world, then they end up not mattering here. This is a universal issue that affects all of us. The Honourable Member for Bath made that point very clearly in terms of the ethnic and cultural survival of ways of life and diversity across China. The Honourable Member for East Working and Shoreham, who's done so much work and has been a leading voice on the issue of Tibet for so long, set out some very tangible and clear recommendations for what we need to do to address these issues. The Honourable Member for Congleton, likewise, and so many other contributions today that we unfortunately don't have enough time to go through in detail. I wanted to say really a few words about where my party sits on this issue, and it's absolutely clear that we are profoundly concerned by the human rights abuses in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslims. We've repeatedly called on the government to take action on this issue, and we're deeply troubled to hear that similar abuses of human rights are taking place in Tibet. The research sets out some very, very disturbing statistics. 500,000 labourers over the first 7 months of 2020. There's a strict military-style management and enforced indoctrination and intrusive surveillance of participants. And it's clear that the programmes aim to reform Tibetan so-called cultural backwardness through learning Mandarin and weakening the way of life and the religious practices of the Tibetan people. Before I appeal, though, to the Minister with some specific recommendations, I wanted to say a few words on the wider context around the policies and activities of the Chinese government. It is becoming increasingly clear that our interaction as a United Kingdom and the interaction and engagement of the United Kingdom government, successive governments since 2010, I'm afraid have been characterised by a sort of naivety and complacency, both domestically and abroad. In 2015, we saw, of course, the announcement by David Cameron and George Osborne of the so-called golden era of Sino-British relations, based on the premise that we would open our markets to China and the Chinese government would reciprocate, whilst gradually aligning with the international rules-based order and opening up to trade with the rest of the world. It was an approach that viewed the UK's relationship with China purely through an economic lens, turning a blind eye to human rights abuses in exchange for the naive and narrow promise of future economic benefit. But the reality is that the benefits of trade have remained largely unbalanced. a process actively encouraged by the Chinese state, which has facilitated the replication of intellectual property and the dumping of heavily subsidised products on European markets, leaving UK firms open to hostile takeovers and driving the UK to a trade deficit with China of around £20 billion a year. Further still, the UK now has 229 supply chains dependent on China, 59 of which relate to our critical national infrastructure. Moreover, we're increasingly isolated on the global stage. Over the past decade, I'm afraid we've gained a global reputation as being alliance breakers, when one of the great strengths of our country has traditionally been our role as alliance makers. And the UK's relative isolation has made it easier for President Xi to press ahead with the imposition of national security legislation in Hong Kong that's been met with international condemnation, the persecution of the Uyghur and Tibetan minorities, destabilizing actions in the South China Sea that are in violation of international law. To summarise, our supply chain dependence on China clearly constrains our ability to stand up for our national interest and for our national security. While this government's approach to international relations has hindered our ability to convene and lead an alliance of democracies, to stand up for our values and interests. The Golden Era strategy was an unmitigated failure, and Britain alone is an agenda that this current government appears to be pursuing is not a strategy at all, it's a recipe for disaster. China respects strength, unity and consistency, but we are in a position where we're starting to look weak, divided and inconsistent, and that has to change. We need a fundamental reset in Sino-British relations and indeed in relations between China and the rest of the world. It's against this backdrop that we're debating Tibet, and our central message to the government is that expressions of outrage are not sufficient. Tangible action is required, and we recommend 3 initial responses. First, the scope of legislation that underpins the so-called Magnitsky sanctions must be broadened, and the senior Chinese Communist Party and Hong Kong executive officials who are clearly responsible for breaches of human rights in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong must be added to the list. The rapidity of the government's recent decision to add senior Belarusian officials to the Magnitsky list was very welcome. But why then is it dragging its feet when it comes to the Chinese government officials? Second, we urge the UK government to revise its risk advisory for British companies that source goods and services from areas that may involve Tibetan forced labour. The vast majority of British companies want to do the right thing. They want to behave ethically, and the government must act to support them in doing so. And third, we support calls for the UK government to push for the appointment of a UN Special Rapporteur for the full and transparent investigation of forced labour and ethnic persecution in Xinjiang and Tibet. The issue of genocide has been raised today, but of course, in order for that to be classified as genocide, very clear and compelling proof and evidence is required. And the way to get that is through international action to get that special rapporteur, because otherwise we can't move forward really in terms of the debate around genocide. I trust that the Minister has taken note of the strong views that have been expressed by honourable members from across the House this morning, and I am looking forward to his response to the specific points and recommendations that have been made. Thank you, Mr Hollobone.
If the Minister could conclude his remarks, please, no later than 10:57. Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hollobone. It's a great pleasure to be back here in this chamber. I would start by thanking my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, for initiating this very important debate. And I'm also very grateful to the contributions and listening to the very strong views from honourable and right honourable members here today in this debate. The honourable members for Bath, my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, honourable member for Bristol East, right honourable member for Orkney and Shetland, and of course my honourable friend from Congleton, the opposition spokesman. Promoting and protecting human rights is incredibly important to this government, no matter where those violations and abuses occur. And as we've heard from my right honourable friend, on the 22nd of September, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China published a report alleging that the Chinese government had expanded a large-scale mandatory vocational training programme in Tibet. The reported nature of this programme is deeply concerning to the UK government, and we take these allegations extremely seriously. The report, as we've heard, alleges coercive vocational training and the transfer of labour. It describes a large-scale campaign to retrain and transfer some rural labourers within Tibet and elsewhere in China. And these allegations do bear similarities with the reported system of forced labour in Xinjiang, including the military-style vocational training, a focus, as we've heard today, on Chinese language training and local middlemen receiving financial incentives to transfer labour throughout Tibet and beyond. However, it's worth noting, as brought up by the Honourable Member for Bristol East, we don't have the clear evidence that the very worst abuses that are taking place in Xinjiang are being replicated as yet in Tibet. There's no evidence of mass extrajudicial internment or of workers being kept in closed and securitised environments like in Xinjiang. But, of course, we are working very closely with the report's author. We're scrutinising that report that's now been out 2 weeks. We're also working, Mr Hollobone, with other experts on Tibet and our international partners so that we can get a clear and thorough understanding of the situation. Mr Hollobone, as is evident from our track record, we do pay very close attention to the human rights situation, not only in Tibet, but right across China. We called on Chinese authorities to lift the severe and unjustified restriction on access for foreigners to Tibet. This has been raised by virtually every honourable and right honourable member here in the chamber. Our officials at the British Embassy in Beijing were last able to visit Lhasa in July 2019, and we're consistent in our calls that access needs to change. We've consistently urged China to respect all the fundamental rights in line with its own constitution and also the international frameworks to which China is a party. The right to freedom of religion or belief applies to the people of Tibet just as it does to the people of Chingford and Woodford Green and elsewhere in the UK. Members have also mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama, my honourable friend, the member for Worthing East. The UK views him very much as a respected spiritual leader, and as such, he has visited the UK on a number of occasions. We continue to do all we can to encourage freedoms for religious and cultural expression in Tibet and across China. I think the honourable member for Bath raised the point about the succession. This is very much the appointment of a new Dalai Lama. It's clearly a religious matter and one for the relevant religious authorities to decide in line with freedom of religion and belief. It's also worth pointing out we've also raised the case of the Panchen Lama with Chinese authorities. We have demanded confirmation of his welfare and also that he enjoys freedom of movement. So this government, Mr Hollobone, I believe has shown time and again that when allegations are substantiated, we will speak out and act to hold China to account. The Foreign Secretary, supported by his ministerial team, we've repeatedly set out our grave concerns about the human rights violations perpetrated against the people of Hong Kong and against Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in Xinjiang. I've done so myself in many parliamentary debates, most recent one last month. We've raised these concerns directly with the Foreign Secretary's counterpart, Wang Yi, on a number of occasions. We've also played a leading role within the international community to hold China to account, with 2 unprecedented joint statements at the UN in the past year. 28 countries joined a UK-led statement at the Human Rights Council in June, and yesterday, Honourable and Right Honourable members will have seen that 39 countries joined a statement at the UN General Assembly in New York, expressing our deep concern at the situation in Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Tibet. I believe this growing coalition reflects UK diplomatic leadership. I have an awful lot of respect from my honourable friend, the opposition spokesman, but I'd rather disagree with him that we have been ineffective in this regard. I think we have shown diplomatic leadership, as these statements in the UN demonstrate, and the personal involvement of the Foreign Secretary is testament to that situation. And at the most recent, at the UN Human Rights Council, we used China's most recent Universal Periodic Human Rights Review to publicly challenge its record and encourage improved compliance with all its international human rights commitments. And last month we dedicated our entire national statement at the UN Human Rights Council to the human rights violations taking place in China. That's only the second time, Mr Hollobone, the UK has dedicated a national statement to a single country, the first being in 2018 on Russia following the poisonings in Salisbury. And as the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have made clear, we want a positive relationship with China. China is a leading member of the international community, and we want to have a strong and constructive relationship in many areas. If I could turn to some of the points raised by Honourable and Right Honourable members. My Right Honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, raised the issue, as did virtually every member here today, about sanctions. We're carefully considering further designations under our newly introduced sanctions regime. It's absolutely essential that sanctions are developed accurately and with the correct evidence. And my Right Honourable friend will know that it's not appropriate to speculate on who may be designated, but it's absolutely right to say that this is something we are constantly reviewing within FCDO. We also, members have mentioned supply chains and the responsibility and the upcoming trade bill, new clause 68. It's absolutely crucial that all businesses conduct the appropriate due diligence to ensure their supply chains are free of forced labour. All members have referenced that there should be a reciprocal access, and that's absolutely the position of the government in terms of unfettered access to these regions. I'll come on to the honourable member for Worthing East and Shoreham's comment shortly. He also referenced judges in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's independent judiciary is a cornerstone of its economic success and way of life. Sadly, the new national security law provides Hong Kong's chief executive with the power to appoint judges rather than the Chief Justice. This does risk undermining the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary. We will monitor this closely, including the implications for the role of UK judges within the Hong Kong justice system. He also mentioned the Olympics. I know this is something the Right Honourable member has been public about. As the Foreign Secretary said yesterday, we're focused on working closely with our international partners to hold the Chinese authorities to account, and we need to build the evidence base on which future action should be taken. Whilst we have no current plans to boycott the Olympics, that is a matter for the sporting authorities, we've been clear throughout that we won't look the other way when faced with egregious human rights abuses in Xinjiang or the violations of the freedoms of the Hong Kong people. The Honourable Member for Bath mentioned the Honourable Member for Worthing East and Shoreham's reciprocal access bill. I want to thank him for his work on the APPG and all he's done to bring the attention to Parliament of what is happening in Tibet. We were very much aware of this bill, which I think has its second reading in March 2021. We will continue to call at the UN and direct with the Chinese authorities for unfettered access to the region, and we will obviously work with and closely monitor my honourable friend's private member's bill. The Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland raised the issue of Inner Mongolia. We've discussed this separately. We'll continue to monitor that situation and continue to engage. And again, he referred to unfettered access to those regions. We will continue to call for this. I know all the opposition spokesmen have also made that point very clearly. My honourable friend, the member for Congleton, mentioned, as of others, about the call for a UN special rapporteur. We've repeatedly called for the UN for China to allow this unfettered access for observers, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's vital that that includes access for Tibet also. She also mentioned the work of Confucius Institutes. It's simple. Any attempt to interfere with academic freedom or freedom of speech will not be tolerated. If any universities or research institutions experience attempts to undermine free debate, we encourage them to come forward and speak to government. Mr Hollobone, in the few seconds I've got left before I hand back to my right honourable friend, we will always act to uphold our values, our interests, our national security, and we are crystal clear with China when we disagree with their approach. We urge the Chinese government to respect all fundamental rights across the People's Republic of China, including in Tibet. We are examining these latest reports of coercive training and transfer of labour in Tibet. We take them very seriously. I want to thank my right honourable friend for bringing it to the attention of the House today, and we're trying to work to establish a full picture of the situation. We've repeatedly held China to account for its human rights violations, and we will continue to do so. We will continue to stand up for our values and act as a force for good in the world.
Thank you. Sir Iain Duncan Smith.
Mr Hollobone, I thank my right honourable friend, the Minister, for his comments at the end of what has been a really powerful debate, I think, many of the honourable right honourable members across the floor. What is clear from this debate, I say to the Minister, what is clear from this debate is that there is now a growing strength and unity across all sides of the House of Commons, that we can no longer consider that the policy initiated, as referenced by the spokesman for the opposition, by the then Chancellor and Prime Minister in a government which I served, which was actually really referred to internally as Project Kowtow, can any longer be in existence. We now need to bear down on Chinese abuse. And the point of this debate today was to highlight the latest level of abuse in Tibet. But more than that, across the board, I urge my right honourable friend in the government to take the following points forward. Make sure the Magnitsky sanctions are now applied to those that are evidenced by these reports and those on Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, all those other areas as well, and particularly on Hong Kong. It's time now to call them out and to put those sanctions in place. We've spent too long thinking about it. We need to condemn those companies that are involved in the links with modern-day slavery and abuse in China, the companies that do that. The government should be calling them out. The way to act here is to bring and to agree the new Clause 68 on the trade bill in the House of Lords, which would then immediately stop that activity. And I do ask my honourable friend to tell those in the government that it is time really to make a position on the Olympics no matter what. I hope today, with the activities of many of my right honourable friends and honourable friends around here, many who have been involved as my honourable friend has, in calling out these abuses in Tibet for a long time, will let the government know. We can no longer just say we want a good relationship and a constructive relationship with China. What we want is an honest relationship with China, one that says when it's wrong, it's wrong. And in this case, if genocide is taking place, if abuses are taking place of human rights, we now, as a government and as a people, must call them out and take action.
The question is that this House has considered reports of China's rapid expansion of the Labour programme in Tibet, co-published by the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. With those members not participating in the next debate on the rule of law, please be kind enough to leave quickly